The screaming started at 3:27 in the morning. A child's voice, thin and desperate, cutting through the howling wind like a blade wrapped in ice. Emma Ashford, 6 years old, stumbled through knee-deep snow outside the mountain lodge in her pink fleece pajamas now soaked through, her small feet already numb, her voice raw from screaming for someone, anyone, to help her. Behind her, the silhouette of a man filled the doorway. Her stepfather. His fists clenched. His rage absolute. Mia Morales didn't think. She moved. The nanny burst from the lodge's side entrance into the freezing blizzard, her own feet bare against the snow, her worn uniform jacket barely reaching her waist. She ran like a woman with nothing left to lose because that was exactly what she was. Her breath came in sharp, burning gasps as she reached Emma, scooped the child's trembling body into her arms, and pulled her away from the screaming man, away from the raised hand, away from the darkness that had followed this family from Boston all the way to this remote lodge on the edges of New Hampshire. Inside the stone hallway of the lodge, near the fireplace where orange light danced against cold walls, Alejandro Castellano watched from the shadows. He stood motionless, a man of 38 years with the face of someone who had seen things that could never be unseen. His dark suit cost more than Mia Morales made in 4 months. The scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone caught the firelight. His hands, resting at his sides, had built an empire on vengeance. But his eyes, those dark storm-grey eyes, were fixed on a nanny with blood dripping from her feet, shielding a terrified child with her own body. The man from the doorway lunged forward, drunk and furious, his hand raised to strike. Mia stepped forward, not back. Her voice came out steady, impossibly steady, barely above a whisper. "I've got you," she said to Emma. "Nobody touches you now." Nobody. Alejandro's eyes narrowed. One finger rose. A signal. In 15 years, Enzo had served this man without question, had carried out orders that left other men's families destroyed, had followed Alejandro Castellano through the darkest streets of Boston's underworld. But even Enzo had never seen Alejandro move with such intention toward a stranger. The Mafia boss stepped from the shadows into the firelight, every movement controlled, deliberate, a predator who had learned long ago that speed was less important than certainty. The stepfather froze. Something in the air changed. The temperature of the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I think," Alejandro said, his voice deep and solid like an oath, like thunder traveling through stone, "you were just leaving." The man's face went white. He recognized nothing specific about Alejandro Castellano. There were no news reports about him, no mugshots in police databases, no public information of any kind. But there was something in the way this stranger stood, something in the absolute absence of mercy in his eyes, that communicated a single terrible truth: this was a man who could end you, and he would do it without hesitation. The stepfather stumbled backward. He reached for his coat. He left the lodge without another word, his footsteps disappearing into the snow and wind like he had never existed at all. Mia turned, Emma still clutched against her chest, and for the first time she truly looked at the man who had just saved them both. Tall. Expensive. Dangerous. A scar on his face that spoke of violence survived, of wars won against enemies she could not name. His coat alone probably cost more than the entire apartment she had lost last month. But his eyes, looking at Emma with an intensity that seemed almost painful, contained something Mia recognized immediately. Mercy. The rarest thing in the world. She didn't know who he was. She had no idea that the stranger in the black coat was Alejandro Castellano, the most feared name in Boston's underworld, a man who answered to no one, whose word carried the weight of death itself. She didn't know that when she had stepped forward instead of back, when she had chosen to protect a child instead of herself, she had been watched by a man whose childhood scars were so deep that he had spent 38 years trying to erase them through an empire built on vengeance. What she did know was that in this moment, standing in a stone hallway in the middle of a winter storm, with a terrified child shaking in her arms and blood dripping from her frozen feet, she was no longer alone. Alejandro's eyes moved from Emma to Mia's face. He saw the exhaustion there. He saw the terror that hadn't fully left her eyes yet. He saw the kind of desperation that only comes from losing everything and having to keep going anyway. His jaw tightened slightly. Something cold and dangerous stirred in his chest, something he had not felt in years. "Come," he said quietly. "You cannot stay here. The storm will worsen." Mia didn't move. Not because she was afraid, though she should have been. She stood frozen because something in her recognized something in him. Two broken people. Two survivors. Two people who understood what it meant to have the world try to crush you and to keep standing anyway. From deeper in the lodge, the sound of footsteps approaching, measured and unhurried. Enzo emerged from the darkness, a man with the shoulders of a soldier and eyes that had seen too much. Behind him came Dario, similar in build, similar in the way he carried himself. The men who served Alindro. The men who followed him into hell without hesitation. "Boss," Enzo said simply, observing the nanny and the child with an expression that revealed nothing. "Prepare the guest room," Alindro instructed. "The one with the fireplace. Bring medical supplies. This woman's feet require attention." Emma's arms tightened around Mia's neck. The child's voice came out small, fragile, like a question asked to the universe with no expectation of an answer. "Will he come back? Will he hurt us again?" Alindro knelt slowly, bringing himself level with the child's eyes. His movements were careful, deliberate, the movements of a man who had learned that children were easily frightened and that some people, some types of people, never forgot the day they learned that not all adults were safe. "No," he said simply. "I promise you. He will never hurt you again." Emma studied his face for a long moment, this man with the scar, this stranger with the dangerous eyes. And then, inexplicably, she nodded. She believed him. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows, testing the strength of the lodge's stone walls. Somewhere in the distance, an engine sound faded. The stepfather's car, driving away into the blizzard, driving away from something far more terrifying than any storm. Before we continue, drop a like if this story hits you. Share it with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming tomorrow. Because what unfolds across the next 72 hours will test everything you understand about mercy, about power, about whether a mafia boss's empire can bend to accommodate one broken woman and a scared child. Now let us go back to the beginning. Let us return to 48 hours before the screaming started, when Mia Morales was just trying to survive one more impossible day. When she had no idea that her life was about to collide with a legend. The bus stop on Hanover Street smelled like diesel fuel and broken dreams. Mia stood in the November cold at 5:43 in the morning, her breath forming small clouds of white that disappeared into the darkness. She wore the black uniform of the Ashford household, a nanny's uniform that had been mended so many times it was more thread than original fabric. Her shoes, bought 7 years ago, had holes in the soles. She had stuffed them with newspaper that morning, the same way she had every morning for the last 3 months. In her coat pocket, folded into a precise square, was a piece of paper that represented the end of everything. An eviction notice. 12 days remaining. $22,000 due or she would be removed from the apartment. Removed. That was the word they used. As if she were an object. As if she were something that did not matter. She had $5 to her name. 5. Not 500, not 5,000. $5, which she had found in an old jacket at the Goodwill store where she shopped for her uniform replacements. That $5 had to last her until her next paycheck, which would come on the 15th. Today was the 8th. The bus arrived. Mia boarded, swiped her card, and found a seat near the back. An older woman with grey hair and a kind face smiled at her. Mia smiled back, the smile of someone who had learned that people could be fooled by a smile, that a person could be completely destroyed inside and still show the world a pleasant expression. She arrived at the Ashford estate in Boston's Back Bay at exactly 6:17 in the morning. The house was enormous, for stories of brick and tradition and old money that had been accumulating since the 1800s. Victoria Ashford owned this place. Victoria Ashford, a woman of 62 years with iron-grey hair and the smile of someone who enjoyed other people's suffering, had hired Mia 3 years ago to care for her granddaughter Emma. Mia let herself in through the side entrance. The kitchen smelled like stainless steel and emptiness. She put her coat on the hook and began her routine. She prepared Emma's breakfast. Oatmeal with cinnamon. Fresh berries if they were available. Today, berries cost money, so today there was only oatmeal. At 7:30, Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, still in her pajamas, her dark hair tangled from sleep. She was 6 years old, with eyes that were far too serious for a child her age. The kind of eyes that came from understanding, too early, that the world was not a safe place. "Good morning, Miss Emma," Mia said, keeping her voice gentle. Emma climbed into the chair at the kitchen table. "Mommy didn't say goodnight last night." She was on the phone with Grand Victoria. They were talking about money. Emma's mother, Victoria's daughter, had married Douglas Hale 6 months ago. Douglas Hale was a man in his early 50s with the bearing of someone who believed that because he had money, he had the right to do whatever he wanted to whoever he wanted. 3 months into the marriage, Mia had noticed bruises on the mother's arms. 1 month after that, there were bruises on Emma. Mia served the oatmeal. "Your mother is very busy." "She's scared," Emma said. It wasn't a question. Mia sat down across from the child. This was the hardest part of her job. Not the cleaning, not the cooking, not the 14-hour days that left her back screaming with pain. The hardest part was looking into Emma's eyes and not being able to promise her that everything would be okay. "I know," Mia said finally. "But you are safe when I am here. Do you understand that? You are safe." Emma nodded slowly. She picked up her spoon. She ate her oatmeal. By 2:38 in the afternoon, Victoria Ashford had called Mia into her study. It was a room of dark wood and darker intentions. Victoria sat behind an antique desk that probably cost more than Mia's entire life savings, and she looked at the nanny with a kind of expression usually reserved for insects. "I am hearing concerning reports from my friends," Victoria said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Reports that you have been speaking to people about my family's private matters. Reports that you have been suggesting to school teachers and neighbors that there are problems in this household." "I have only told the truth," Mia said quietly. "The truth," Victoria laughed, "a sound like broken glass, is whatever I say it is. You are an employee. You are here at my sufferance. You can be replaced with a single phone call. In fact, I think that might be exactly what needs to happen. You have become a liability. A problem." Mia's hands clenched into fists. She had $312 in the bank. $312 stood between her and the streets. $312 was not enough for first month, last month, and deposit on a new apartment. $312 was not enough for anything at all. "Please," she said. The word came out like it had been scraped from her throat. Emma needs stability. Emma needs to understand that certain people are above judgment. Emma needs to learn that loyalty to family matters more than making accusations. Emma needs to understand her place. The sound of the front door slamming echoed through the house. Footsteps in the hallway. Heavy, aggressive footsteps. Douglas. Back early. Victoria smiled. "This conversation is finished. But not your employment, not quite yet. That will come next week. I will give you 7 days to find new employment, and then you will leave this household. Do you understand me? 7 days. She had been evicted in 12 days. Now she had been fired in 7. The mathematics of survival were no longer adding up. The numbers had become impossible. The evening news reported snow moving in from the northwest. A major winter storm, the meteorologist warned, the first real snow of the season. Within 36 hours, the northeastern corridor would be buried under 18 to 24 inches of accumulation. Travel would become dangerous. Mia was watching the forecast when the phone call came. It was Victoria. "Change in plans," she said, and Mia could hear the pleasure in her voice. "Douglas has a business meeting in New Hampshire. There is a mountain lodge near the Vermont border. We are all going there for the weekend. You will accompany us. We leave tomorrow morning. Pack accordingly." The call ended. Mia sat in the darkness of her tiny apartment, the eviction notice unfolded on the table in front of her, the $5 beside it like an accusation. She had no idea what awaited her at that lodge. She had no idea that the storm moving toward New Hampshire would trap her there, would trap her with a man whose violence was escalating, would trap her in a place where a stranger was watching from the shadows. She had no idea that in less than 36 hours, the screaming would start. And she had absolutely no idea that the man who would save her was waiting, watching, already moving pieces into place for a reckoning that would reshape all of their lives. Outside, the November wind began to pick up. The first snowflakes fell on Boston like a warning. The child's screams pierced through the mountain lodge like a blade. Emma Ashford, 6 years old in pink fleece pajamas now soaked through with snow, stumbled barefoot across the frozen ground outside the lodge, her small legs sinking into drifts that reached her waist. Behind her, silhouetted in the doorway, her stepfather's shadow stretched across the white landscape like a curse. Mia Morales didn't think. She moved. One moment she was inside the lodge's stone corridor, folding towels in the dim light. The next moment she was barefoot in the blizzard, her uniform torn at the shoulder, her hair wild, her feet already bleeding from the contact with ice. She ran toward Emma, screaming, voice like a prayer without words. The November wind tore at her skin like 1,000 tiny knives. She grabbed the child and pulled her backward, away from the doorway, away from the man whose voice was now roaring into the storm. Douglas Hale was drunk. She could smell the whiskey on him from 3 feet away, could see the way his movements were unsteady, dangerous. He stumbled down the snow-covered steps, his hands clenched into fists. "Give her to me," he shouted. "She is mine. That child is mine." Mia didn't answer. She stepped in front of Emma, her body a shield, her spine straight despite the cold that was turning her lips blue. The child's fingers dug into her uniform, trembling. "Nobody touches this child," Mia said, her voice barely a whisper but steady as stone. "Not you. Not tonight. Not ever again." Douglas laughed, a sound like broken glass. He raised his hand. That was when the man in the shadows stepped forward. Alejandro Castellano stood near the massive fireplace inside the lodge, his face illuminated by orange flames, his expression absolutely still. He was 6 feet 1 inch tall, built like a general surveying a battlefield, with dark hair silvered at the temples and a scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone like a map of violence. He wore a cashmere coat in charcoal gray, worth more than everything Mia Morales owned, worth more than a year of her wages at the Ashford household. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, penetrating, cold, seeing everything. For 15 years, Marco and Enzo had been his men. They had watched him move through the Boston underworld like a ghost made flesh, building an empire from blood and vengeance and absolute control. But in all of those 15 years, they had never seen him respond like this. They had never seen him move toward vulnerability instead of away from it. He raised one finger. Just one. Enzo, standing near the entrance to the lodge's main hall, understood. He moved without a sound, his footsteps muffled on the stone floor. Within seconds, Douglas Hale found himself surrounded by 3 men in expensive black suits, all of them radiating the kind of quiet that precedes violence. Douglas's face went white. He lowered his hand. "Inside," Alejandro said, and his voice was deep and solid like an oath. Not loud. Not threatening. Simply inevitable. "You will come inside. Now." The men escorted Douglas Hale back through the lodge doors. Mia stood in the snow, Emma shaking against her chest, and watched as the stepfather disappeared into the warmth and darkness inside. For a moment, there was only the sound of the wind, and the child's ragged breathing, and the snow continuing to fall in heavy, relentless waves. Then Alejandro Castellano stepped out into the blizzard. He wore no coat over his suit. The snow landed on his shoulders and in his dark hair, and he didn't seem to notice. His eyes moved over Mia's bleeding feet, her torn uniform, the way she was holding the child like someone would hold a prayer. "Come inside," he said. "Both of you." Mia didn't move. She had learned long ago not to trust men who gave orders, not to follow men who assumed compliance. She had been running from men like this for 8 years, ever since she left Douglas the first time. "Why would you help us?" she asked, and her voice was shattered like glass. "I am nobody. Emma is nobody. Why do you care?" Alejandro looked at this woman in front of him, this nanny with torn clothes and bleeding feet and absolute defiance in her eyes despite the cold that was killing her, and something shifted in his chest. Something cold and dangerous and unexpected. "Because the people who did this believed you were nobody," he said quietly. "And that belief needs to be corrected." He stepped back inside the lodge and held the door open. After a moment, Mia moved. She carried Emma toward the warmth, toward the fireplace, toward a man whose name she did not yet know, whose power she could not yet imagine, who was already beginning to see his own childhood nightmare reflected in a child's tears. The door closed behind them. Outside, the November wind continued to howl, carrying snow that would accumulate for the next 36 hours, that would trap them all in this place together, that would become the setting for a reckoning none of them could anticipate. Inside the lodge, Alejandro watched as one of his household staff brought towels and blankets. He watched as Mia wrapped the child in warmth. He watched as Emma's trembling began to slow. And in the firelight, his scar caught the orange glow, making him look like something carved from stone and suffering. If you're staying with us, you understand why this moment matters. Drop a like if you see what's about to unfold. Subscribe now because in the next part, we're going back 48 hours to understand how a woman with $5 in her pocket, an eviction notice in her coat, and nothing left to lose ended up here. And we're going to meet the people who wanted her to disappear. Now let us go back. Let us go back to 2 days before the screaming. Let us go back to when Mia Morales still believed she was alone. The apartment was small enough that she could touch 2 walls at once if she stretched her arms. The radiator hissed and clanked, producing no heat. November had arrived in Boston with teeth, and Mia's breath formed small clouds as she sat at the kitchen table, counting money with the precision of someone for whom mathematics meant survival. $5. A $5 bill, 3 ones, and 4 quarters. $8.03 if she included the coins from her coat pocket. Minus the dollar she needed to keep the phone line active, because if she missed a call from an employment agency, she would lose her last chance at work beyond the Ashford household. That left her with $7.03 to last until Thursday. It was Monday. Monday night, 11:48 p.m. according to the clock on the wall that she couldn't afford to replace when it started running slow. The eviction notice sat unfolded next to her money. The landlord had written the amount in red ink as if the color could puncture her flesh and make the number more real. $22,000. That was what she owed. $22,000 for the apartment where her mother had died 5 years ago, where Mia had spent every cent she could scrape together trying to keep the place because it still smelled like her mother's perfume, that particular brand of lavender that she'd worn since Mia was a child. Now she had to leave that smell behind. 7 days. The landlord had given her 7 days. She had already been evicted once before. When she was 23 years old, when Douglas Hale had controlled every dollar and forbidden her from working, when she'd come home one afternoon to find all of her belongings piled on the street and a locksmith changing the locks. That had been 8 years ago. She'd sworn she would never be that helpless again. Now, at 31 years old, she was helpless in a different way. The job at the Ashford household paid $450 per week. Barely enough to cover the apartment and the groceries and the bus fare and the phone bill that kept her connected to the world. She had been saving for 8 years, putting away $5 or $10 every week, until she had managed to accumulate $2,000 in a savings account at the bank 3 blocks away. $2,000 was the emergency fund. The thing that stood between her and the street. Last month, Emma had fallen off the jungle gym at school and broken her arm. The medical bills had consumed $800 before the insurance kicked in. Then the rent had gone up. Then her phone screen had cracked and she'd needed $90 to replace it because her job required her to be reachable. The $2,000 had become $1,147. And this morning, the landlord had delivered the notice. Mia pulled out the help wanted section of the newspaper, the one from 3 days ago that she hadn't yet had time to read. She circled listings with a pen that was running out of ink. Waitressing jobs. Housekeeping positions. Anything that paid hourly and asked no questions. The phone rang at 12:34 in the morning. She knew who it was before she answered. Mia? Victoria's voice came through the line like honey laced with poison. Did I wake you? No, Mrs. Ashford. Good. I've made a decision. Victoria was calling from her bedroom in the Ashford mansion, an 8,000-square-foot home where every room had a purpose and a decorator and a price tag that exceeded Mia's entire life. Your services are no longer required. Mia's hand went to her chest. I'm sorry. I'm firing you. Emma will attend a different school next year. There are more qualified nannies available in Boston. The Ashford name deserves better. You have 7 days to secure new employment and vacate the suite we've provided above the garage. The mathematics were becoming impossible. 7 days to find new work. 7 days to move. 7 days until homelessness arrived like an appointment she couldn't cancel. Yes, Mrs. Ashford, Mia heard herself say. Pack warm clothes. The lodge is in New Hampshire. We leave tomorrow morning at 6. And Mia? Wear something appropriate. The neighbors might see you. The call ended. Mia sat in the darkness of her apartment, the eviction notice unfolded on the table in front of her, the $5 beside it like an accusation. She had no idea that within 36 hours, Emma's screams would split the night. She had no idea that the storm moving toward New Hampshire would trap all of them together. She had no idea that a man was waiting in the shadows of that lodge, a man whose childhood had been scarred by abandonment and violence, a man who had built an empire from vengeance and who had sworn that no child under his watch would suffer as he once had. Outside her window, the first snowflakes began to fall on Boston like a warning. The alarm on Mia's phone screamed at 4:56 in the morning, and she silenced it before it could wake anyone in the mansion above her head. The room was smaller than most closets, 7 feet by 9 feet, with a single window that looked out onto the servants' parking area where her 2008 Honda Civic sat like a confession of poverty. She sat up on the twin bed, her breath forming small clouds in the cold, and reached for the lamp. The $5 were still there on the nightstand where she had left them the night before. She picked them crumpled bills up with both hands, as if they might dissolve. One $5 bill. That was everything left after she had sent $240 to her mother's medical fund 3 days ago. Her mother was 61 years old and the cancer had returned. The hospital bills were stacked in a showbox under Mia's bed, each one stamped with numbers that made her stomach hollow out: $47,000 for the surgery, $12,000 for the 6 weeks of chemotherapy, $8,500 for the scans they had to repeat because the first set showed something the radiologist wasn't sure about. On her pillow lay the eviction notice. It was printed on cream-colored paper, official and merciless, and the deadline was written in red ink that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. $22,000. 12 days. The landlord of the duplex her mother rented had sold the building to a developer who wanted to tear down the entire block and build luxury condominiums. Everyone had to go. Everyone had to leave. And Mia had $5 to her name. She dressed in the dark, pulling on the black pants and white blouse that were the uniform of invisibility in the Ashford household. The pants were worn thin at the knees from kneeling to pick up toys Emma had scattered across the marble floors. The blouse had a small stain near the collar that no amount of bleach could erase, a permanent record of a moment when Emma had knocked over a cup of coffee while Mia was carrying her on her hip. The kitchen was already warming when she arrived at 6 in the morning. The industrial refrigerator hummed its mechanical song. Mia moved through the space like a shadow that had learned to be useful, pulling eggs from the ceramic holder, heating the cast iron skillet, measuring coffee grounds into the machine. Every movement precise. Every movement quiet. every movement designed to be forgotten. At 6:15, Victoria Ashford entered the kitchen wearing cream-colored Chanel from head to toe, her blonde hair styled into a perfect wave, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who believed her face was a business investment. She was 52 years old but had spent enough money on her appearance that most people guessed 42. She smelled like tuberose and money. "You're 20 minutes late," Victoria said, and it was not true, but Mia had learned that truth was negotiable in this house. "The eggs are cold. Look at them. They're sitting there like," Victoria made a face as if she had tasted something rotten. "Emma deserves better than someone so careless. So unstable. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "Yes, Mrs. Ashford," Mia said. "I'm sorry. I'll make fresh ones. You know what? Never mind. I've lost my appetite." Victoria picked up her coffee mug, the one with her initials monogrammed in gold leaf. "I'm going into the office early. Tell Emma Mommy will be late tonight. Try not to let her watch too much television. She's already starting to develop your mannerisms, and frankly, that's concerning." Mia cracked 3 new eggs into the skillet and did not speak. By 3:30 in the afternoon, she was picking up Emma from the Ashford Academy, an exclusive private school where tuition cost more than Mia made in 3 months. Emma was 6 years old with dark curls and her mother's sharp blue eyes, but something in her expression, a softness, a readiness to trust, came from somewhere else entirely, some recessive gene that had nothing to do with Victoria. "Vivi!" Emma called out, using the nickname she had invented for Mia weeks after she arrived. "Vivi, did you know that Miss Patterson said I have the most beautiful penmanship in the whole class? She said it's like calligraphy." "What's calligraphy?" "It's a kind of fancy writing," Mia said, and her chest tightened the way it did every time Emma called her Vivi, like love and devastation all at once. "Your handwriting is beautiful, Emma. You're beautiful." The car was parked in the circular drive. Mia held Emma's hand and walked toward it, and that's when she saw him. Douglas Hale stood beside a blue sedan across the street, his hands in his coat pockets, watching. He was 31 years old and handsome in the way that certain men were, aggressively, unkindly handsome, like a knife wrapped in a smile. He had dated Mia for 8 months before she recognized the pattern, the small criticisms that felt like affection, the isolation from her friends disguised as protection, the rage that erupted without warning over nothing at all. When she finally ended it, he couldn't accept that it was over. He called. He showed up at restaurants where she was working. He sent messages that escalated from romantic to threatening. She had filed for a restraining order for months ago, and the judge had granted it, and then nothing had changed because Douglas's cousin was Detective Brian Hale, and Detective Brian Hale had made the restraining order disappear from the system like it had never existed. Mia's hand tightened on Emma's fingers. She didn't look at him directly, but she felt his eyes tracking her, burning like 2 small fires that refused to go out. "Come on, sweetheart," she said to Emma. "Let's get in the car." She fastened Emma into the booster seat in the back, and her hands were shaking. The engine started. She pulled out of the circular drive without looking in the mirror, even though she could feel him watching, could feel the weight of his attention like a physical thing pressing against the back of her head. 3 blocks away, at a stoplight, her phone buzzed. The text came from a number she knew by heart even though she had deleted it 17 times, "You can't hide forever." Emma was singing a song about colors, something she had learned at school. Red is for happy days, and blue is for sad days, and yellow is for days when you don't know what you feel. Mia's throat closed up. That evening, Victoria called her into the main office while Emma was doing her homework upstairs. The office was decorated in shades of white and grey, like being inside a cloud made of money. Victoria sat behind a desk made of pale wood that probably had a name, a designer, a price tag that would have made Mia's eyes water. "I need to discuss the weekend with you," Victoria said. "We're closing up the Boston house and heading to New Hampshire. The estate up there. Emma will need you, of course. She gets anxious when there are changes. But I need to be clear about expectations." "Of course," Mia said. "You'll accompany us tomorrow morning at 6. Pack light. Appropriate clothing. You understand that you'll be staying in the staff quarters this time, not in the house with us. There's a blizzard warning for Saturday. We may be there longer than planned, depending on road conditions. You'll be responsible for Emma's meals, her bedtime routine, her laundry. Keep her occupied. Keep her calm. And Mia? Yes? Do not discuss your personal problems with Emma. She's 6 years old. She shouldn't have to worry about adult issues. Can you promise me that? I promise. Victoria dismissed her with a wave of her hand, and Mia walked back upstairs to where Emma was sitting at the kitchen table, drawing a picture of a girl with very tall hair standing next to a woman with a huge smile. That's you, Emma pointed at the woman. That's Vivi. And that's me. We're happy in this picture. Mia sat down beside her, and Emma leaned against her shoulder, and for a moment, the weight of the $5, the eviction notice, the text messages from Douglas, the impossible mathematics of survival all faded away. There was only this, a child, a drawing, the quiet hum of the house settling around them as evening turned to night. The eviction notice was still in her coat pocket upstairs. She had folded it carefully and placed it in the interior pocket, where it felt like a stone. 12 days. $22,000. The impossibility of it was so complete, so absolute, that sometimes it felt almost like peace. How could you fight something so much larger than yourself? How could you compete with gravity? Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall, soft and silent, accumulating on the streets of Boston like a erasure, like a forgetting. Somewhere in the darkness to the north, a storm was gathering. Somewhere in a mansion built of stone and secrets, a man was sitting in a library reading a report about a shipment that had gone missing, unaware that his world was about to collide with a woman who had $5 to her name and a child who drew pictures of happiness like it was something simple and achievable. Mia held Emma closer and watched the snow fall outside the window, each flake a small promise that morning would come again, and then another morning, and then another, each one indistinguishable from the last, each one equally impossible to survive. The kitchen was warm. That was the only mercy left in the world on this night. The kitchen of the mountain lodge was warm, and Emma sat at the table with her small hands wrapped around a mug of hot chocolate, her fingers pale against the ceramic, her eyes tracking the miniature marshmallows floating on the surface like tiny life rafts. Mia stood at the counter, stirring a second mug, and she was singing. Not loudly. Just barely above a whisper, a lullaby her own mother had sung to her 32 years ago, before everything broke. The song had no words that mattered, only a melody that said, "You are safe, you are safe, you are safe." A lie, but a kind one. Outside, the storm was becoming something alive. The windows rattled. Not gently. The November wind tore through the mountain pass like a blade wrapped in ice, and the snow was falling so thickly that the world beyond the glass had disappeared into white. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees, and the lodge's heating system labored against the cold with a sound like something mechanical dying. Through the walls, Mia could hear the other voices, Victoria's husband, Thomas Ashford, drunk since 7 o'clock, his words slurring into ugliness the way they always did when the sun went down and the wine glasses filled and refilled and filled again. Emma's fingers tightened around the mug. Is he mad? Emma asked, her voice so small it almost got lost in the wind's howling. No, Mia said, and sat down beside her, and that was a lie too, but lies were what you gave children when the truth was too sharp to hold. He's just tired. People are loud when they're tired. The stepfather's voice rose from somewhere deeper in the house, and Emma flinched. Mia put her arm around the girl's shoulders and pulled her close, and they stayed like that, two people in a warm kitchen pretending the world outside was not screaming. At 9:47 in the evening, the screaming became worse. A crash came from the other room, something breaking, glass or ceramic, or the sound of rage taking physical form. Emma's body went rigid against Mia. Then a child's cry, not Emma's, but close, and Thomas Ashford's voice roaring, and that was when Mia moved without thinking, without the small cautious calculus that had kept her alive for so long. She stood, and she walked into the adjoining hallway, and what she saw was a man twice her size with his hand locked around Emma's arm, lifting her small body off the ground as she dangled and kicked and screamed about juice, about spilled juice on his newspaper, about how clumsy children are nothing but accidents waiting to ruin everything. The rage in Mia's chest was like a blade cutting through air. "Let her go," Mia said. Her voice was steady. That surprised her. That surprised everyone, including Thomas Ashford, who turned to look at her with the eyes of someone who was not accustomed to being contradicted by nannies. "This is not your concern," he said, and his words were wet with alcohol and authority. "Let her go." He reached out with his free hand and shoved her. Not violently, not with enough force to truly hurt, but enough to send her backward into the wall hard enough that the breath left her lungs. And in that moment, while Mia was still sliding down the wall, Emma twisted free and ran. She ran toward the side door. She ran in only her pajamas, her small feet bare, her heart beating so hard it could probably be heard from the moon. The door was not locked. In her panic, in her small child's calculation that running was the only answer left, Emma yanked it open and burst into the blizzard. The cold hit her like betrayal. Mia didn't hesitate. She didn't stop to put on a coat. She didn't stop to call for help. She simply moved, following Emma's small silhouette as it disappeared into the white, and the snow swallowed her bare feet, and the wind tore at her clothes, and she was running, always running, chasing a child into a landscape that was trying very hard to kill them both. Emma had made it 200 yards before the cold and the dark and the impossibility of the snow overcame her. She was stumbling now, her body already beginning to betray her, hypothermia's whisper telling her to just lie down, just rest, it would be easier than moving. Mia caught her, lifted her, held her against her chest, and Emma was so cold she felt like she was made of winter itself. "I've got you," Mia said, breathing hard, her own feet already numb. "I've got you, Mija. Stay with me." Ahead, through the white, a light. There was a house. A lodge. Lights burning in the windows like an invitation or a promise or maybe just the accident of geography that meant salvation was possible if you could only reach it. Mia ran toward the light. She reached the door and pounded on it with a fist that had stopped feeling anything at all. Behind her, Thomas Ashford had come to the lodge's entrance, silhouetted in the doorway, but he was not following. He was just standing there, watching, as if the storm and the cold and his stepdaughter's disappearance were all just weather, just inconveniences. The door opened. The man who stood in the frame was tall, somewhere beyond 6 feet, with shoulders that filled the space like he was taking up more room than his body actually occupied. He wore a black cashmere coat that cost more than a year of Mia's old rent, and his dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and his face was an architecture of controlled power interrupted by scars, a thin line running from his right eye toward his cheekbone, another across his knuckles, another disappearing beneath his collar. He looked at Mia. He looked at Emma. And then he looked past them, into the storm, and his entire body shifted into something sharp and dangerous. "Bring her in," he said, and his voice was quiet and solid like an oath, like stone, like a man who was very accustomed to being obeyed. Mia stepped forward, and he reached out and took Emma from her arms. The child was trembling so violently her whole body was a single shudder, and he turned and moved deeper into the house, and Mia followed because there was nothing else left to do, no other choice, no other option in a world that had narrowed down to this: survival, warmth, light, and a stranger's mercy. Behind her, the door closed. The wind howled at the glass as if it was furious at being locked out. In the library of the neighboring estate, only half a mile away through the snow, Alejandro Castellano stood at the window, and he had seen everything. He had watched the small figure stumble through the white. He had watched the woman run barefoot into the storm. And he had watched as they reached his lodge, as his men opened the door, as they were pulled to safety inside. He turned to look at Enzo, who was standing beside him with his hands clasped in front of him, waiting for orders the way lieutenants do. "There is a child in my house," Alejandro said quietly. "A woman who is not Victoria Ashford. Send someone to find out who they are. And find out why a child was running through a blizzard at 9:53 in the evening with no one protecting her." "Yes, sir," Enzo said, and he was already moving toward the door. Alejandro turned back to the window and watched the snow fall. He was thinking about a different storm, a different child, a different night that had happened 43 years ago when he was 6 years old and his mother had tried to run, had tried to escape, had tried to carry him through snow much like this. That had not ended in safety. That had ended in a police officer returning him to his father and his mother disappearing into a darkness that had never released her. In his chest, something cold and dangerous stirred. He had sworn that no child would ever run through a storm on his watch, unprotected and terrified. He had built his entire empire on that oath. He had broken men for less. He had taken from the world in ways the world still did not understand, all in the name of that singular promise: never again would a child be abandoned. And now there was a child in his house, wet and shaking and frightened, being held by a woman whose eyes had held something he recognized very well indeed. The look of someone who had nothing left to lose. The wind outside had teeth. It gnawed against the windows of the mountain lodge like something alive, something hungry, something that wanted in. The blizzard had arrived 3 hours early, catching everyone off guard, turning the Friday evening into a nightmare of white and cold. Snow piled against the glass in drifts that reached 3 feet high, and the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees outside, with wind gusts that made the whole structure shudder. Inside the main room, a fireplace crackled and hissed, throwing orange shadows across mahogany walls that had seen 100 winters but never one quite like this. The warmth did nothing to reach the kitchen where Mia Morales stood at the counter, stirring hot chocolate with a wooden spoon, her movements careful and deliberate, like someone performing a ritual that might keep the world from breaking apart. Emma sat at the small table behind her, drawing with crayons on construction paper, her 6-year-old fingers pressing too hard, the way children do when they are trying not to listen to the sounds coming from the living room. The sounds were getting louder. Victoria's husband, Robert Ashford, had started drinking at 7 o'clock. He was the kind of drunk who grew meaner with each glass, his voice climbing in volume and dropping in humanity until it became something unrecognizable. Mia had learned to track the progression. First came the loud laughter. Then came the complaints about money, about the lodge being too cold, about the staff being useless. Then came the anger that needed an object, a target, something small enough to break without consequence. "Emma, come here," Mia said, keeping her voice soft and steady, the way you speak to a frightened animal. "Let me see what you are drawing." Emma looked up, her eyes 7 years too old for a 6-year-old's face. The child had learned to read rooms the way soldiers read battlefields. She understood danger by instinct. "Colors for sad days," Emma whispered, holding up a paper covered in dark purples and grays and blues. "When she feels sad, look at this." Mia's chest fractured into pieces she did not know how to reassemble. She set down the wooden spoon. The hot chocolate steamed in 2 mismatched mugs, one with a chip on the rim, the other cracked down the side but still holding liquid. She handed one to Emma and kept one for herself, and they sat together in the kitchen while the storm clawed at the windows and the man in the other room got louder. At 9:47 in the evening, Robert Ashford roared about spilled juice. There was no spilled juice. There was only Emma, who had taken a glass to her room earlier and left it on her nightstand, a glass that had been empty for hours. But Robert had found it, and in the architecture of his drunken logic, the empty glass became proof of disrespect, of carelessness, of a child who needed correction. Mia heard the crash of the glass hitting the floor. She heard his voice ascending into a register that belonged to something not entirely human. She did not hesitate. She moved toward the living room, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, her hands already reaching. What she found was Robert with his hand around Emma's small arm, his fingers crushing the soft skin above her elbow, his face the color of wine and rage. Emma's mouth was open in a silent scream, the kind children make when they are too terrified to make sound. "Let her go," Mia said. Not a question. A statement. A command delivered in a voice that surprised even herself with its steadiness. Robert turned toward her, and in his eyes was the glittering calculation of a man deciding whether he could do 2 terrible things in one night. He could. He decided he could. He shoved Mia backward with his free hand, and she hit the wall hard enough that the air left her lungs. In that single moment of breathlessness, Emma wrenched free and bolted. The child ran toward the nearest door, the side entrance that faced the mountain, and she did not stop to put on shoes or a coat. She simply ran. And Mia, gasping, with stars blooming in her vision, ran after her. The cold hit them like a physical force, like stepping into a living thing that existed only to destroy. Emma's small body in pink pajamas disappeared into white, and Mia did not think. She did not calculate. She did not do anything but move forward into the blizzard, her feet bare on snow that cut like broken glass, her breath coming in gasps that froze in her lungs. "Emma," she screamed, and the wind swallowed her voice entirely. "Emma, come back." The child was 200 yards away now, maybe more, moving in a direction that had no sense to it, that led away from the lodge and deeper into the white nothing. Mia's feet had stopped working properly. Cold had a way of stopping feet. Cold had a way of stopping hearts. But she kept moving anyway, kept screaming, kept pushing through the snow that reached to her knees, then her thighs. There. A shape. A small silhouette stumbling, falling, trying to stand again. Mia reached her and swept Emma up, her own body a cage trying to contain the child's shaking. Emma's skin was already cooling. Her lips were already turning the pale color of someone leaving the world. Hypothermia worked fast on small bodies. It worked like a knife through butter, like something designed specifically for the destruction of children. "I have you," Mia whispered against Emma's frozen hair. "I have you, baby, I have you." But she was lost. Completely lost. The lodge was behind her, but the snow had erased it. There was no direction, no sense, no light anywhere except for one distant glow to her left, a warm amber light bleeding through the white like a prayer being answered by something not quite divine. She ran toward it. Her legs were numb now, moved only by will, by some ancient instinct that refused to let go. Emma weighed nothing. Emma felt like holding smoke. The door appeared through the blizzard, a massive wooden barrier backed by darkness, set into a stone structure that loomed like a fortress. Mia did not think. She did not plan. She simply used what was left of her strength to pound on it with her fists, to scream, to beg in Spanish and English and the universal language of a woman who has nothing left but the child she is holding. "Please. Please. Please. She is freezing. My baby is freezing. Someone please open the door." The seconds stretched. The cold was winning. She could feel it pulling Emma away, could feel the child's body growing lighter, colder, could feel the moment approaching when letting go would start to seem like an option. The door opened. The man who stood in the threshold was 43 years old and dressed in black cashmere that cost more than everything Mia had ever owned combined. He was tall, 6'2", with shoulders that filled the frame, with dark hair silvered at the temples and a scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to his jaw like a map of something ancient and terrible. His eyes were grey, the color of storm clouds, and they were looking at Emma. Just Emma. Nothing else. Only the child. "Bring her in," he said, and his voice was deep and solid like an oath, like a promise that could move mountains. Mia did not question. She did not hesitate. She stepped across the threshold into warmth so sudden and complete that it felt like drowning in reverse. Behind the man, 2 other men appeared, both in dark suits, both watching with the careful attention of soldiers waiting for orders. "Get blankets," the scarred man said without looking away from Emma. "Warm water. Not hot. Warm. She is hypothermic. And call Dr. Marino. Tell him to come now, whether or not." "Yes, sir," one of the men said, and he was already moving, his movements the kind that came from years of practice, from understanding that questions were not part of his job. The scarred man extended his arms toward Mia. His hands were large and scarred across the knuckles, but the way he held them, the way his eyes had softened just slightly when looking at the shivering child, suggested hands that had learned to be gentle despite what they had been trained to do. "Give her to me," he said. Mia's arms did not want to let go. But she did. She placed Emma into those careful hands, and the man wrapped the child in his own cashmere coat, which swallowed her completely, and he carried her toward the fireplace like he was carrying something sacred. Like he was carrying a piece of his own soul. Mia stood there in the entryway, water dripping from her clothes, her feet bleeding from the snow, shaking so badly that her teeth made sounds, and she understood something in that moment with absolute clarity. She had just stepped into a world she did not know how to navigate. She had just entered the house of someone powerful beyond measure. She had just, without knowing it, placed herself and Emma under the protection of a man whose scarred knuckles and careful eyes suggested he had spent 43 years becoming something that most people spent their lives learning to fear. Outside, the blizzard raged. Inside, the fireplace crackled and burned. And neither of them knew that this night, this terrible night, was the night everything would change. The fireplace crackling filled the silence as Mia sat beside Emma, wrapped now in layers of blankets that smelled like expensive cologne and cedar wood. The child's breathing had steadied. Her lips had lost that terrible blue-white tint. Enzo appeared in the doorway carrying a medical case, his movements precise, efficient, the kind that came from years of existing in dangerous spaces. Alejandro knelt beside Emma, his scarred knuckles surprisingly gentle as he pressed a thermometer against her forehead. The trembling had stopped. Her eyes were closing, the shock wearing off into something like safety. He waited. The thermometer beeped. 94 degrees, he said quietly. She will recover. Keep her warm. Do not let her sleep for another hour. He stood slowly, gripping the armrest of the chair for balance. The movement was small. Most people would have missed it. Mia did not. His face had gone pale beneath the scar that ran from his left eye to his jaw. Dario moved without being asked, one hand reaching out to steady him. When did you last eat? Dario asked, his voice the kind of careful that suggested this was not a new question. This morning, Alejandro said, but his hand was trembling as he steadied himself against the high-backed leather chair. Enzo and Dario exchanged a look. The kind of look that meant something was wrong. Something serious. His blood pressure dropped when he carried her from the snow, Enzo said to Dario, but loud enough for Mia to hear. The stress. The cold exposure outside. Mia's eyes moved from Alejandro to Enzo to the medical case still open on the table. Bandages. Syringes. A blood pressure cuff. But something else too. A bag of 4 solution. Tubing. Equipment that meant what came next was not simple. He needs a transfusion, Enzo said, still watching Alejandro, who had closed his eyes and was breathing through his teeth like a man managing pain. His blood type is rare. AB negative. Our doctor is 3 hours away and the roads are sealed. Mia stood without thinking. The blanket fell from her shoulders onto Emma's form. The child was already drifting toward sleep, exhausted past the point of consciousness. Test me, Mia said. Both men turned. Enzo's face showed something between disbelief and the dawning of understanding. Civilians do not offer their blood to people they do not know, Enzo said carefully. Test me, Mia repeated. I want to know if I match. The rapid test took 7 minutes. Enzo's hands were steady as he pricked her finger, drew the blood onto a strip, ran it through a small portable device that hummed and beeped. His eyes widened slightly. The kind of widening that meant the universe had just done something unexpected. AB negative, he said quietly. You are a match. 1 in every 1,000 people carry this blood type. In Boston, maybe 200 people total. He looked at her with something between gratitude and awe. In 10 years, I have never seen a civilian offer this to him. He helped Emma, Mia said simply. Now I help him. The transfusion happened on the leather sofa closest to the fire. Mia lay on her back, her left arm extended, the needle sliding into the inside of her elbow with a sting that faded quickly. Alejandro sat in the chair beside her, unconscious or very close to it, his own arm connected to hers through tubing that carried her blood toward his heart. She watched it happen. Watched her own blood flow through the plastic tube, watched the 4 bag slowly deflate as her body's strength moved into his veins. The firelight caught the red liquid in the tubing, made it glow like something sacred, something that belonged to prayer more than medicine. His color returned slowly. grain by grain, like a photograph developing in shadow. The grey beneath his eyes faded. His breathing deepened. His free hand, the one that had carried Emma like she was made of light, relaxed against the armrest. 50 minutes passed. Then an hour. The bag emptied completely and Enzo disconnected the tubing with practiced gentleness. Alejandro's eyes opened. He did not look at Enzo. Did not look at Dario, who stood a respectful distance away, his expression carefully neutral. His eyes found Mia's face immediately. They were dark eyes, storm grey in this light, and they held an intensity that made her chest tighten. "You did not have to do this," he said. His voice was different now. Less edged. Like a blade that had been sheathed. "Yes, I did," Mia said. Her own voice was barely more than a whisper. "You saved her." He studied her with an expression she could not name. Not quite wonder. Not quite confusion. Something that lived in the space between those two things. His eyes moved across her face like he was trying to read something written in a language he had forgotten. "What is your name?" he asked. Dario and Enzo both stiffened. The question hung in the air like a bell that had been struck. "Mia," she said. "Mia Morales." He nodded slowly, as if her name meant something. As if by speaking it, she had told him a story about herself that was written deeper than words could reach. "And you?" she asked. The silence that followed stretched like pulled taffy. Enzo and Dario exchanged a glance that was almost invisible. Almost. "Alejandro," he said. Just Alejandro. In 15 years of working for him, Enzo had never heard him give his name to an outsider. Never offered himself as anything less than a title, a reputation, a fear that walked on two legs. He turned away slowly, understanding without being told that something had shifted in the room. Something that could not be unshifted. Hours passed. The blizzard continued to howl outside the windows, wind pressing against the glass like something alive and angry. Emma slept deeply in a guest bedroom upstairs, her breathing steady, her color restored. Mia had changed into dry clothes that Victoria's house staff had procured. They fit like they were tailored for someone else, because they were. Everything in this place existed on a scale that did not include her. The clock struck midnight. The fireplace still burned. Alejandro sat in his chair, and Mia sat in the chair across from him, separated by a low table of polished marble that reflected the firelight. "Why did you run into the blizzard for a child who is not yours?" he asked. His voice had a rawness to it now. Like something inside him was worn thin. Mia's hands folded in her lap. The question had teeth. She felt them. But she answered anyway. "Because I know what it is like when nobody comes," she said. Her voice broke on the word nobody. She swallowed. Continued. "I was 9. In a foster home in Portland. The man who lived there was angry. He drank. One night, the anger turned into something else. Something that made me scream. I called for help. I screamed so loud that my voice gave out. And nobody came. Nobody." She raised her eyes to meet his. The next morning, the social worker said I had misunderstood. That I was acting out for attention. That I was the problem, not him. 6 months later, I was placed in a different home. And I swore to myself that if I ever saw a child in danger, I would be the one who came. I would be the one who did not let my fear or my comfort or my fear of not being believed stop me from running. Alejandro listened with absolute stillness. The kind of stillness that meant every word was landing like stones in deep water. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice came from a place so deep it seemed to echo from the stone beneath the house. "I was 8 years old in Naples. My father was a man who hit things when he drank. My mother, mostly. One night, the hitting did not stop. I hid in a closet between the kitchen and the pantry. It was so small that I could barely breathe. I could hear every sound through the wood. Every scream. And I was so afraid that if I made any noise, he would find me and it would be worse. He paused. His hand was trembling slightly as he raised a glass of water to his lips. My father died when I was 12. Heart attack. No justice. No consequence. Just gone. And I decided in that moment that I would build something. An empire. A network. A system that would ensure that no child under my watch would ever hide in a closet and wait for someone to save them. Because I understood what it meant to realize that nobody was coming. Mia's eyes were wet. She did not try to hide it. That's why you let us in, she said. He nodded. I heard the child screaming. And I heard the storm. And I made a decision that my men will probably spend weeks trying to understand. The moment stretched between them like silk. Morning came grey and hostile. The blizzard had softened into a steady snow that fell without urgency, like the sky had finally tired itself out. The roads, according to Enzo's phone calls, were passable. Not safe, but passable. Mia was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee that tasted like it cost more than her daily rent, when the sound of tires on gravel cut through the white silence. A black sedan that was not a car so much as a mobile argument with physics pulled up to the front entrance. The door opened before the engine died, and Victoria Ashford emerged like a curse-given human shape. She was 53 and had spent 30 years refusing to age gracefully, which meant she had fought every grey hair and every line with the desperation of someone who believed that beauty was the only currency that mattered. Her coat was Chanel. Her shoes were Prada. And her expression was the kind of fury that came from not being obeyed. She did not ring the doorbell. She pounded on the door with her fist. Enzo opened it before the second knock. His face showed nothing, but Mia could see the tightening around his eyes. He knew exactly who this woman was. Probably knew exactly what she was about to do. "Where is my stepdaughter?" Victoria demanded, not bothering with greetings. "And where is my employee?" Mia stepped forward. She could feel her hand shaking. Emma was still upstairs. Emma was safe. She told herself this like a prayer. Emma was safe. "Emma is fine," Mia said. She was hypothermic. She needed. "You took her without permission," Victoria cut through her words like scissors through silk. "You abused your position of trust. And now I am firing you. Effective immediately. Pack your things and leave this property within the hour." Mia felt the world tilt slightly. Firing her. No job meant no paycheck. No paycheck meant the eviction notice in her coat pocket, $22,000 in 12 days, written in red ink like a threat, like a bleeding wound on paper. "Mrs. Ashford, if you would just let me explain," Mia began, but Victoria's laugh was sharp and cutting. "I will make sure no family in Boston ever hires you again," Victoria said, her voice dripping with precision. "Everyone will know that you are unstable, unreliable, prone to hysterical overreactions. You will not find work as a janitor when I am finished with you." Behind Mia, a door opened. Footsteps came down the marble hallway. The kind of footsteps that did not rush or hesitate. The kind that belonged to someone who had never been told no and did not expect to be told no now. Alejandro stepped forward. He was still wearing his clothes from yesterday, but he moved like a man who had slept peacefully and woken refreshed. He looked at Victoria Ashford with an expression of such absolute zero that Mia felt her breath catch. "Leave," he said. His voice was quiet. Almost gentle. Which made it infinitely more terrifying. Victoria's eyes widened. "I am sorry, who are you?" "I do not know you." "Mia, is this one of your lovers? Is this why you brought my stepdaughter to some man's house?" Enzo leaned down and whispered something into her ear. Mia watched the color drain from Victoria's face. Watched her skin go from angry red to a sickly white. Watched her mouth open and close without sound. I did not know, I will just," Victoria turned and walked back to her car. Not ran. but moved with the desperate speed of someone who understood that she had just made a mistake that could not be fixed with money or connections or anything else in her arsenal. The car pulled away. Within minutes, it was gone, the sound of its engine swallowed by the falling snow. But Alejandro was still standing in the doorway when the next sound came. The sound of tires on the driveway again. A different car. A drunk man stumbling out of the driver's seat with a gun in his hand. Douglas Hale had not slept in 36 hours. His eyes were the eyes of a man whose mind had been circling the same obsession like a shark that smelled blood. He had tracked Mia's phone. He had driven through the blizzard with single-minded determination. He had convinced himself that wherever she was his to retrieve. "You ran from me," he said, his words slurring together. "Again. I am so tired of you running. You belong to me." Mia backed toward the door. The fear that had lived in her chest for 18 months suddenly felt like it had teeth and claws and the weight of a coming storm. "She told you to leave," Alejandro said. He had moved between them like a wall. Like a monument. Like the mountain that does not move when the wind pushes. Douglas pulled the gun up. His hands were shaking. Which made it infinitely more dangerous. Dario and Enzo drew their guns in one fluid motion. The sound was like thunder that echoed in reverse, a sound that had already happened but was only now being heard. For 5 seconds, the world was suspended in amber. Then Douglas understood something in his mind. He ran. Back to his car. Back down the driveway. Back toward the world that had not yet caught up with him. Alejandro watched him disappear into the snow, then turned to Mia. She was shaking so badly that her teeth made sounds. "How long has this been happening?" he asked. 18 months, Mia whispered. "The restraining order means nothing. His cousin works for the Boston police. He tells Douglas everything. Every time I try to get help, nothing happens. They say I am being hysterical. They say men like him are just protective. They say I should be grateful that someone loves me that much." Alejandro's expression went arctic. The scar on his face seemed to deepen, to darken, to become something older and more dangerous. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me everything." She did. Every detail. Every threat. Every ignored police report. Every time Douglas had appeared at her workplace. Every time she had changed her phone number and he had found her again. Every moment of terror that had accumulated like snow on a roof, layer upon layer until something had to break. When she finished, Alejandro asked the question that had been waiting since the moment she had given him her blood. "Why would I help you?" he asked. "You said it yourself. You are nobody." Mia looked at him. Really looked. At the scar. At the careful hands. At the eyes that had seen terrible things and still chose to save a child in the snow. "Because the people who did this to you, they believed you were nobody," Alejandro said. His voice was not soft, but it carried softness in it anyway. "They believed your screams did not matter. That your fear was acceptable. That your survival was not worth their effort. And that belief needs to be corrected." He leaned forward. "You stood between a child and danger without thinking about the cost. You gave your blood to a dying stranger without asking why. You are not nobody, Mia Morales. You are the kind of person this world needs more of. And I have already made a decision about what comes next." Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, Enzo and Dario exchanged a glance that confirmed what they had suspected since the moment their boss had knelt beside that child in the snow. Something fundamental had changed. And none of them would be the same after this night. The rain fell like bullets against the third-floor landing. 38 degrees, the March cold cutting through wet fabric, through skin, through bone. Mia's hands trembled as she turned her key in the lock, and the apartment door swung open to reveal the wreckage of her life. The eviction notice lay on the counter where she had left it, those red letters screaming their arithmetic of destruction, $22,000. 7 days. Now 5 remained. She counted the money again. 5 crumpled dollar bills. That was all. Every other penny had gone to groceries that weren't enough, to a child's birthday gift bought from a thrift store, to the bus fare that had carried her away from Douglas so many times. $5 stood between her and absolute nothing. The apartment was already half-packed, boxes stacked like coffins, her possessions reduced to what could fit in a sedan that didn't belong to her anyway. The hallway door clicked open behind her. Douglas Hale stood in the threshold, rain dripping from his shoulders, his jacket dark and heavy. He was 43 years old but looked older, his face carved by rage into something that barely resembled human anymore. His eyes were the color of old bruises. Under his jacket, she could see the outline of the gun. "You're coming with me," he said. His voice carried no inflection, no emotion. Just certainty. The certainty of a man who believed ownership never expired. Mia's body went rigid. The $5 were still in her hand. She closed her fist around them, as if those crumpled bills were armor. "No," she said. He moved toward her, one step, deliberate and unhurried. His right hand drifted toward the gun. The sound of rain intensified beyond the broken skylight above them, a downpour that had been hammering the city since dawn, turning the streets into rivers of March cold. Water dripped through the broken glass ceiling in steady intervals. Plunk! 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 The rhythm of time running out. She thought of Emma. The child safe in Alindro's compound, surrounded by people who would protect her with their lives. Emma's drawing was still in Mia's bag, the one she had made from the car window as they drove away from the mountain lodge. Stick figures holding hands. Colors bleeding into each other, a child's version of family. Written beneath in uneven crayon letters, "You saved Emmy." Douglas raised the gun. Not quickly. With the slowness of a man who knew he had time. The world compressed into a single moment. Mia saw the barrel, black and absolute. She saw his finger finding the trigger. She saw the end of everything written in the trajectory of that metal. Her mind ran through options like a drowning person grasping at branches. Scream and he fires. Run and he catches her on the stairs. Fight and he is twice her size, twice her weight, a man constructed entirely of violence. Maybe this is how it ends, something inside her whispered. Maybe I was always going to lose. Then something else ignited in her chest. Not hope. Not courage exactly. Something harder. Something that looked at Emma's drawing and would not accept erasure. "No," Mia said again. Her voice was steady this time. "I am done being afraid." Douglas's expression twisted. He took another step forward. 12 men materialized from the stairwells and doorways as if the building itself had exhaled them. Enzo from the landing below. Dario from the apartment across the hall. 10 others in black tactical gear, weapons drawn with the precision of men who had rehearsed this moment. They moved like ghosts, like the building had been prepared for this assault for hours, every position calculated, every angle covered. Douglas spun, the gun wavering in his hand. The color drained from his face, and in that instant, he became what he truly was, a small man with delusions of power, now confronted with the reality that power had a shape much larger than his own. He dropped the gun. It clattered against the linoleum, a sound sharper than any shot. "Please," Douglas began, falling to his knees, his voice cracking into pieces. "Please, please, please, I didn't mean it. I'll leave. I swear I'll disappear." Alindro stepped from the shadows of the stairwell. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than Mia's annual salary, his dark hair slicked back, the scar on his face catching the dim hallway light. His expression was ancient. His voice dropped like winter. "Too late," he said. Federal agents in dark jackets flooded the building simultaneously, moving with the coordination of an operation that had been planned with surgical precision. They cuffed Douglas with efficiency, reading his rights in voices that carried no pity. The guns. The stalking across state lines. The conspiracy with his cousin to ignore restraining orders. The detailed documentation of every threat, every appearance, every violation of the peace. 18 months of evidence, one agent said quietly to Alejandro as they led Douglas toward the stairs. "Cousin's corruption going back 5 years. Your investigator gave us everything." Douglas screamed as they descended. The hallway amplified his voice, multiplied it, made it echo against the concrete walls like the sound of something dying. By the time they reached the ground floor, his screams had become something inhuman, something that bounced off the lobby mirrors and scattered into the rain. The news cameras were waiting outside. Red and blue lights from police vehicles painted the wet street in colors that looked like bruises. Within the hour, every news outlet in Boston had broadcast the image: Douglas Hale being led in handcuffs past cameras, his face a landscape of collapse, his shirt torn, his composure obliterated. The federal charge was clear. 40 years. Stalking across state lines. Conspiracy with a corrupt officer. Assault. The mathematics of his destruction were elegant and complete. But the destruction did not stop there. 3 blocks away, at the Boston Police Department, Douglas's cousin was being led from his desk in handcuffs of his own. 15 officers watched in silence as the badge was stripped from his chest. The pension he had been building for 21 years was frozen in legal accounts, seized as part of the conspiracy investigation. The uniform that had granted him authority was returned to a locker, and he was processed into the same federal system as his cousin. Separate trials. Separate cells. Total annihilation of everything he had built on corruption. Meanwhile, across the city in a mansion in Beacon Hill, Victoria Ashford woke to the sound of her front door being broken down. Federal agents in dark jackets moved through her house with warrants that detailed 5 years of tax evasion, fraudulent invoices, shell companies routing money into accounts with names that had nothing to do with legitimacy. But deeper than that, embedded in those warrants like a bullet beneath skin, was the evidence of something worse: her knowledge. Her participation. Her deliberate choice to enable the abuse that her household staff had endured, the negligent oversight that had allowed her husband to operate without consequence. Alejandro's investigators had been thorough. They had found receipts for the silence. Emails documenting her awareness. Bank transfers that represented payment for her indifference. She was led from her mansion in a bathrobe, her hair uncombed, her face the color of ash. The cameras flashed. The news helicopters circled overhead. Within 4 hours, every major news outlet had run the story: wealthy Boston socialite arrested on federal fraud and child endangerment charges. The word enabler appeared in every headline. The phrase "knew and did nothing" became the refrain. Her trial would take months. The sentence, when it came, was 40 years in a federal prison 3 states away from anything she had ever owned. Her assets were frozen. Her reputation, which had taken decades to construct, was demolished in 72 hours. The social circles that had once orbited her turned away as if she had become contagious. Alejandro watched both arrests from the interior of a black SUV parked across the street from Victoria's mansion. Enzo sat beside him, the lieutenant's expression unreadable. Neither man spoke as police led Victoria toward the waiting vans. Neither man smiled. Justice, Alejandro had explained to Mia that night in the hallway, was not about death. Death was too quick, too easy, too merciful. Death was forgetting. Death was relief. This was better. This was 40 years of remembering. 40 years of understanding what they had destroyed in other people. 40 years of living with the consequences of choices made in a moment when they believed themselves beyond consequence. The rain continued to fall across Boston, washing the streets clean, indifferent to the arrests and the ruined lives and the federal charges stacking up in courtrooms across the city. Inside the apartment on the 3rd floor, Mia stood alone. The eviction notice was still on the counter. The $5 were still in her hand. But something fundamental had shifted in the space between heartbeats. The apartment that had felt like a tomb now felt like something else. Like a beginning instead of an ending. She picked up Emma's drawing from her bag and held it to the light. Stick figures. Crayoned colors bleeding into each other. A child's documentation of rescue. Of being seen. Of being saved. Outside, the rain began to lighten. Outside, the rain fell in sheets that hammered against the apartment building like 1,000 desperate fists. The sky above Boston had turned the color of a bruise, that sickly purple-gray that comes just before everything breaks. Mia climbed the stairwell to her third-floor apartment, her uniform still damp from the dinner shift, her feet aching in shoes held together with tape and prayer. The broken skylight above the landing leaked in a steady rhythm, drip, 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 each drop hitting the concrete like a countdown clock. She did not know that Douglas Hale was waiting in the shadows of the hallway. The eviction notice was still on the kitchen counter where she had left it that morning. Red ink screaming across white paper. $22,000. 12 days to find money she did not have and could never earn. Mia set her bag down and reached into her jacket pocket with trembling fingers. The 5 crumpled dollar bills were still there. That was everything. $5 and a dream that had already died somewhere between the restaurant and home. She opened her apartment door and stepped into the darkness. "Hello, Mia." His voice came from behind her, from the hallway she had just walked through. She spun around and there he was, Douglas Hale, the man who had haunted her for 14 months like a curse that could not be erased. Thin shoulders, hollow cheeks, eyes that had gone cold in a way that made her skin crawl. But it was what he held in his hand that stopped her breathing. A gun. Black metal catching the dim light from the stairwell. The barrel pointed at her chest, steady and patient, like a blade. "You've been ignoring my calls," he said, stepping into her apartment without invitation. "You've been running from me. That ends tonight." Mia's hands rose of their own accord, that ancient gesture of surrender that meant nothing. "Douglas, you need to leave. You need to get help. Please." "You're coming with me," he said, and his voice carried the flat certainty of someone who had already decided how this would end. "We're going to get in my car. We're going to drive somewhere quiet. And then we're going to have a conversation about what you owe me." The rain intensified outside. Sheets of it, driving against the windows. Cold March rain at 38 degrees, the kind that cuts through clothing and skin and settles in the bones. Mia's mind raced through the calculus of survival. Scream and he shoots. Run and he is faster, stronger, already positioned between her and the door. Fight and he is twice her weight with a gun in his hand. The apartment felt like a cage made of her own bad luck. "The police have your restraining order," Mia said quietly. "My landlord knows you've been here. People saw you in the building." Douglas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The police have my cousin on payroll. He makes sure nothing gets filed properly. Nothing gets investigated. You called 911 3 times in the last 2 months. 3 times, Mia. You know what happened to those reports? They disappeared. And your landlord." He gestured with the gun toward the hallway. "I had a conversation with him about the value of staying quiet." The $5 bills in her pocket felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. The eviction notice on the counter seemed to laugh at her silently. Everything she had worked for, every double shift, every meal skipped so Emma could eat, every dream she had allowed herself to imagine during the brief moments when exhaustion finally dragged her into sleep, all of it was collapsing. Not because of Alejandro Castellano. Not because of Victoria Ashford. But because of this hollow-eyed man with a gun and a voice like venom. "I can't," Mia whispered. "I won't." Douglas took a step forward. The barrel of the gun pressed closer. "You don't get to decide anymore." Then everything changed. The sound came first. Not a gunshot. Something else. The metallic scrape of a stairwell door being yanked open with force. Then footsteps. Multiple footsteps. Heavy boots on concrete, moving with the precision of men who had trained together for years. Douglas's body went rigid. He spun toward the sound, the gun wavering for just a moment, and in that moment, Mia saw her chance the way you see a life raft in the darkness. 12 men emerged from the stairwells and doorways in perfect synchronization. All dressed in black. All moving like ghosts, like weapons, like a prayer answered in the worst possible way. Enzo was the first, his face a mask of controlled rage. Behind him came Dario, and behind Dario came 10 more, tactical vests over their shoulders, hands resting on pistols that stayed holstered only because the men understood restraint. "Drop it," Enzo said, his voice like ice. Douglas raised the gun, but there was no strength left in him. Mia could see the moment he understood. The moment he realized that he had miscalculated so completely that there was no calculation that could save him. He was a small man with a small gun facing an army that had materialized from the shadows like judgment. He dropped the weapon. It clattered against the floor and skittered across the tile, coming to rest against the far wall. Douglas collapsed to his knees, his body folding like a puppet with its strings cut, and the sounds that came from him were not the sounds of a man anymore but something else. Something broken. "Please," he begged. "Please, I didn't mean it. I'll leave. I swear to God, I'll disappear. I'll never contact her again. Just please, don't." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. He was begging for his life the way a drowning man begs for air, understanding only now that air was something that could be taken away. Alejandro Castellano stepped from the shadows of the stairwell. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, the way a general surveys a battlefield after the battle has already been decided. His coat was charcoal gray, tailored to perfection, worth more than Douglas Hale would earn in 3 years of actual work. He looked down at the man on his knees, and there was no anger in his eyes. Anger required emotion. What looked back at Douglas was something colder. Something that had moved beyond anger into a place where mercy went to die. "You stalked her," Alejandro said, his voice deep and solid like an oath. "You threatened her. You ignored a restraining order that should have meant something. You corrupted a police officer to do it. You came to her home with a weapon with intent to cause harm." He paused. "My men will take you now to a location where federal agents are waiting. You will be charged with stalking, assault, conspiracy, and threatening the life of a person under my protection. The charges will be televised. The evidence will be public. Every network in this city will broadcast your name and your face and your crimes." The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows like applause. "But the federal charges are not the worst part," Alejandro continued. "The worst part is what happens to your cousin. He will face his own charges for obstruction of justice, corruption of a public official, and conspiracy. He will lose his badge. He will lose his pension. He will lose his freedom. He will spend the next 20 years in a federal prison understanding that his decisions cost him everything." Douglas was crying now, tears mixing with rain and desperation. "Please, I just wanted her to understand, I was in love with her." "You were not in love with her," Alejandro said quietly. "If you had been in love with her, you would have let her go. But you could not let her go because she was never a person to you. She was a possession. And when she tried to leave, you could not accept it. That is not love. That is entitlement. An entitlement is something that needs to be corrected." 2 of Enzo's men pulled Douglas to his feet. His legs did not support him. They dragged him toward the stairwell, his body leaving a trail of tears and rain and the evidence of his complete collapse. Within minutes, he was gone. The FBI van that had been waiting 3 blocks away pulled up to the curb. Agents flooded from the interior. Cameras appeared. News crews that had been coordinated by Alejandro's people positioned themselves perfectly to capture every moment. By morning, Douglas Hale's face would be on every screen in Boston. By the evening news cycle, it would be on screens across Massachusetts. By the end of the week, his name would be a searchable tragedy, a cautionary tale, the kind of story that played in repeat on true crime channels and discussed in shocked whispers over dinner tables. 40-year federal sentence. No parole eligibility for 20 years. Complete and total destruction, not of his life, but of his future. But that was only half of it. Meanwhile, across the city in the Beacon Hill mansion where Victoria Ashford had entertained senators and judges and the wealthiest families in New England, federal agents were executing a warrant that had been prepared with the same precision that Alejandro used to plan everything. The pre-dawn raid caught her in her bedroom, still in her silk nightgown, the one that cost more than Mia's rent for 6 months. They led her out in handcuffs past photographers positioned at every angle. Her face, that face that had smiled through charity galas and philanthropic lectures, was now twisted with shock and fear. The charges were extensive. Tax evasion stretching back 15 years. Fraud related to the property she managed. But the most damning charge was child endangerment. Alindro's investigators had found documentation of her husband's abuse of the children in her care, the domestic violence that had been reported and documented, and Victoria's systematic cover-up of all of it. She had known. She had always known. And she had done nothing. The trial would take months, but the outcome was certain before it began. The evidence was too extensive. The witnesses too credible. The documentation too thorough. 40 years in federal prison. Her assets frozen. Her reputation, which had taken decades to construct with careful charity work and strategic generosity, demolished in 72 hours. The social circles that had once orbited her turned away as if she had become contagious. Alindro watched both arrests from the interior of a black SUV parked across the street from the FBI command post. Enzo sat beside him, the lieutenant's expression unreadable. Neither man spoke as police led Victoria toward the waiting vans. Neither man smiled. "Justice," Alindro said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had thought carefully about what he was about to explain, "is not about death. Death is too quick, too easy, too merciful. Death is forgetting. Death is relief. This is better. This is 40 years of remembering. 40 years of understanding what they destroyed in other people. 40 years of living with the consequences of choices made when they believed themselves beyond consequence." The rain continued to fall across Boston, washing the streets clean, indifferent to the arrests and the ruined lives and the federal charges stacking up in courtrooms across the city. Inside the apartment on the 3rd floor, Mia stood alone. The eviction notice was still on the counter. But Alindro had made a phone call while his men were processing Douglas. A single conversation with a judge. A word to a lawyer. The notice was no longer valid. The debt had been erased. Not because she could not pay it, but because Alindro had decided that she would not pay it. The $5 were still in her hand. But something fundamental had shifted in the space between heartbeats. The apartment that had felt like a tomb now felt like something else. Like a beginning instead of an ending. She picked up Emma's drawing from her bag and held it to the light. Stick figures. Crayoned colors bleeding into each other. A child's documentation of rescue. Of being seen. Of being saved. Outside, the rain began to lighten. 1 year later, the city of Boston transformed beneath Mia Morales' feet in ways she could not have imagined 12 months before. The apartment she stood in now sat on the 23rd floor of a building with floor-to-ceiling windows facing the harbor, morning light pouring across pale wood floors that had never known the stain of struggle. Outside, the city sprawled like a living thing, awake and breathing, and somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of traffic moving in steady, purposeful rhythms. This was her space. Her apartment. Her life. Bought not with borrowed money or desperate prayers, but with her own hands and her own determination. She had used the envelope Alindro left behind, $22,000 in cash, a single handwritten note that read, "You saved my life. Let me help you save yours," to enroll in nursing school. 12 months of 17-hour days. Double shifts at Boston Children's Hospital, textbooks spread across every available surface, her mind absorbing anatomy and pharmacology and the 1,000 small mercies that made the difference between life and death. She had graduated with distinction. She had earned the title that mattered more than any amount of money. Nurse. Healer. Savior. The blue scrubs hanging in her closet were still damp from this evening's shift. She had held a 3-year-old through a fever that broke at 11:51 p.m. She had stood beside parents terrified beyond language. She had placed her hand on a child's forehead and felt, beneath her palm, the human miracle of a body fighting its way back to wholeness. This was what she did now. This was who she had become. Emma called twice a week. The child was in second grade now, a small bright thing with Mia's eyes and a laugh like bells. She did not call Mia by any formal name. She called her what she had called her in that blizzard night, sheltered in Alindro's house while the world froze outside. "Vivi," Emma said into the phone last Tuesday. "Vivi, I got an A on my math test. I kept thinking about what you said. About how numbers are just stories we tell ourselves about how much things matter. A 7-year-old, understanding metaphor. A 7-year-old, loved so completely that her small mind had transformed into something that could hold both mathematics and wonder." Mia stood on her balcony now, the Friday evening air cool against her face. The harbor stretched beyond the building, lights beginning to blur as dusk settled across the water like a sigh. She had not seen Alindro Castellano in 12 months. He had disappeared after the trials, after Douglas Hale was led away in federal custody, after Victoria Ashford's face was splashed across every news outlet in the Northeast. He had given her space. That was what he told himself, what his men reported back to him from careful distance. She needs to heal. She needs to become strong without needing me. She needs to know that her life is hers alone. But every night, without fail, at 11:11 p.m., a single black car would drive past her building. She had noticed it on the 14th day of her new apartment. She had noticed it for 351 days after that. She never acknowledged it. She never looked directly at the vehicle. But she knew. The way a person knows when they are being watched by someone who cares about their existence. The way a person feels the gravity of another's attention even when distance separates them. She was still wearing her hospital scrubs. The name tag read M. Morales, RN, and beneath it, the Boston Children's Hospital logo in small blue letters. She had not changed because she wanted to remember this day on her skin. 12 children saved. 12 lives turned from crisis toward healing. 12 families who would go home tonight and find their children sleeping soundly, breathing deeply, alive. The balcony door opened behind her. She did not turn around immediately. The footsteps were familiar in a way that lived deeper than memory, in the cellular intelligence of a body that recognized another body after months of separation. She felt the air shift. She felt the presence of him like the presence of weather. "You became a nurse," Alindro said. His voice was deeper than she remembered, or perhaps she had forgotten how it sounded in the physical world, as opposed to in dreams where he had visited her 50 times or more. Mia spun. The city lights blurred and steadied. There was the man who had knelt beside a terrified child with hands so gentle they seemed incapable of the things his reputation whispered. Black suit. Black shirt. The scar that ran from his left eye to his cheekbone catching the last light of evening like a blade wrapped in silver. He stood in her doorway, not crossing the threshold of the balcony, keeping distance between them like a man who understood the physics of respect. "How did you find me?" The words came out barely above a whisper. "I've always known where you were," he said. "I just waited until you didn't need saving anymore." Mia's breath caught somewhere in her chest and refused to complete its journey. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. She had imagined his words, his expression, the exact angle of his body in the doorway. But imagination was a liar. Imagination could not capture the way his eyes had changed. They were softer now. Older. As if he had aged not in days but in the interior spaces where a person learns what it costs to become human again. "Why are you here?" she asked. He moved closer, one step only, then stopped. His hands remained at his sides, palms open, a gesture that said, "I am not a threat. I am not here to take. I am here to ask if you will give. Because I need to tell you something I should have said 12 months ago." His voice carried the weight of a man who had spent an entire year organizing his thoughts into words that might survive the space between them. That night in the blizzard, when you gave your blood to a stranger, when you ran barefoot into a storm for a child you barely knew, you didn't just save my life, Mia. You reminded me what it feels like to be human. She could not move. The city continued its movement around her, indifferent. Cars passed on the streets below. People walked toward their own conversations, their own nights, their own small miracles. For 15 years I built walls, Alejandro continued. I became someone who couldn't feel, couldn't trust anything except money and power and the loyalty of men who feared me. I was a fortress made of scars. Then you appeared, and you were stronger than any fortress because you were not built on fear. You were built on love for a child you barely knew. On mercy for a man who had no right to it. And every wall I built came down. He took one more step forward. Now they were close enough that she could smell him, the scent of expensive cologne and rain, as if he had driven through the city with the windows down, let the evening soak into him. I'm not asking you to love a monster, Mia. I'm not asking you to save me again. I'm asking if you would give a chance to the man you helped me remember I could be. Mia's eyes filled with tears. Not sadness. Not fear. Something else entirely. Something that felt like coming home after a journey she did not remember beginning. I don't see a monster, Alejandro, she said. Her voice trembled like a candle in the wind, fragile and burning. I never did. I see the man who knelt beside a terrified child with the gentlest hands I've ever seen. The man who gave me my life back and asked for nothing in return. He reached out and took her hand. His skin was warm. His grip was careful, as if he was still learning the language of gentleness, still translating violence into touch. He pulled her close, foreheads touching, the city lights blurring around them into watercolor shapes and soft confusion. Then let me spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of the gift you gave me, he whispered against her forehead. When they kissed, it was not a moment captured by passion. It was a moment captured by recognition. Two broken people, finally understanding that wholeness sometimes requires another person's hands. Requires another person's breath. Requires trust that no wall, no matter how high, can compare to the architecture of love. The rain that had fallen all day across Boston began to lighten. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing fragments of stars. On the street below, Enzo sat in the black SUV, watching the balcony through the glass, watching the moment when the most dangerous man in the Northeast held a woman like she was made of light. Enzo smiled. In 15 years of service, he had never seen Alejandro Castellano smile like he was smiling now. Like a man who had been forgiven. Like a man who had been found. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the harbor, Emma Ashford slept in her small bed in her small house, unaware that her sister figure and the man who had become her protector had finally crossed the distance between them. Unaware that the next morning would bring news that would change her life once more. But that was a story for a different night. 1 year had passed since the night the sky broke open and showed them both what was possible. Mia Morales walked through the halls of Boston General Hospital at 6:11 in the morning, her white coat crisp, her name badge reflecting the fluorescent light. Nurse. The title still felt like a gift she might accidentally return. Her dark hair was pulled back cleanly. Her hands, no longer calloused from double shifts at diners, moved with the confidence of someone who had earned her place. She carried a tablet, 2 patient charts, and inside her jacket pocket, a worn photograph of a 5-year-old girl standing in snow. In the parking lot below, a black Mercedes idled with its engine running. Alejandro Castellano sat behind the wheel, a travel coffee cup in one hand, a second cup waiting on the passenger seat. He wore a charcoal suit and no tie. The scar that ran from his left eye to his cheekbone caught the morning light. His dark eyes watched the hospital entrance like a man watching for a miracle he no longer had to fear would disappear. When Mia emerged through the glass doors at 3:15 in the afternoon, her shift over, he stepped out of the car. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Controlled. A man who had commanded armies of darkness was now mastering the small language of ordinary devotion. He handed her the coffee without speaking. She took it, and her fingers brushed his. How many? He asked. 4 admitted. 2 discharged. 1 I wasn't sure about until the lab results came back, and then she was fine. Mia took a long drink. You're here early. I'm always here when you finish. His voice was like distant thunder, but the words themselves were gentle. That is not early. That is reliable. They drove through Boston in silence, the kind that no longer needed filling. The silence of people who had learned that sometimes the greatest intimacy exists in the spaces between words. Rain had fallen that morning, washing the streets clean. Now the sun was breaking through the clouds in long, golden rays that struck the wet asphalt like brushstrokes on canvas. Emma's adoption hearing is finalized, Mia said quietly. The Johnsons called this morning. They want her to spend the full month with us before the transition. They think it will help her feel secure. Alejandro's grip tightened on the steering wheel. When he spoke, his voice was careful, like a man handling something fragile. What do you want? I want her to know that we will always be here. I want her to understand that not all men hurt children. That not all men leave. She turned to face him. That you didn't leave. They arrived at the mountain lodge at 5:32 in the evening. The same lodge where a blizzard had brought them together. Where a man had recognized his own childhood terror in a child's screams. Where a woman with $5 and unshakable mercy had given her blood to save a stranger. This time, there was no snow. November had turned gentle. The grounds were lined with autumn leaves, bronze and gold, and the afternoon light made everything look forgivable. Emma Ashford, now 7 years old with her hair in 2 braids that Alejandro had learned to tie himself, was building a snowman from the remnants of the previous week's storm. She worked with absolute concentration, her small mittens pressing snow into shape. The head is too big, she announced to no one in particular. Snowmen are not proportional. In real life, a head this big would fall over. Alejandro crouched beside her. Then we rebuild it smaller. Logic before aesthetics. That is my rule, Emma said, very seriously, and handed him a handful of snow. Inside the lodge, through the tall windows, Mia watched them work together. She watched a man who had built an empire on fear learn to build something with a child. She watched him laugh, actually laugh, when Emma's snowman collapsed and she declared it a structural failure, not a character defect. She pressed her forehead against the glass. Enzo and Dario stood in the kitchen behind her, making coffee. They exchanged a glance that had become familiar over the past year. He's different, Dario said quietly. He's human, Enzo corrected. He finally became human. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep in the room they kept prepared for her, after the house had settled into the rhythm of breathing people at rest, Mia and Alejandro stood on the balcony overlooking the property. The stars were visible. The November wind was cold but not cruel. He stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting against her hair. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Running into that blizzard. Everything that came after. She turned in his embrace to face him. Douglas Hale is serving 47 years in federal prison. Victoria Ashford lost her fortune, her standing, and the ability to hurt anyone again. Emma is safe. I finished my nursing degree. I'm saving people instead of just trying to survive. She paused. No. I don't regret any of it. But if you could go back. If I could go back, Mia interrupted, I would run into that blizzard again. I would give you my blood again. I would stand between you and the world again. She reached up and touched the scar on his face. Because you became a good man. Not because of fear or power, but because you chose to be. Every single day, you choose gentleness. He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then found her mouth. This time there was no urgency, no desperate recognition of 2 broken people finding each other. This time it was the kiss of people who had chosen each other in the daylight and would keep choosing. When they pulled apart, she whispered something against his chest. What did you say? He asked. What if I hadn't run into that storm? He pulled back enough to look at her. His dark eyes held hers like an anchor. Then I would still be half dead in more ways than one. The morning they left the lodge, Emma sat between them in the Mercedes, chattering about snowman proportions and the probability of snow in December. Enzo drove them back to the city through clear streets and clear sky. That night, in the apartment that Alejandro had bought for Mia, the one that had never been about possession but about creating a space where she could breathe without fear, she sat on the balcony alone. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago. The woman with $5 and an eviction notice in red ink. The woman who ran into a blizzard not knowing she was running toward everything. She thought about how small acts of courage echo louder than empires built on fear. How giving your blood, standing between a child and danger, running into a storm, these are the moments that reshape the world. She thought about how strength is not walls and distance. Strength is letting someone see your scars. Strength is choosing gentleness when cruelty would be easier. She thought about Douglas Hale, rotting in a cell, understanding finally that cruelty always has a reckoning. She thought about Victoria Ashford, stripped of power, understanding that the powerful who abuse the powerless will eventually face someone more powerful who won't look away. The rain that had fallen that morning had cleared by evening. The sky was visible now, scattered with stars. And somewhere beyond the city lights, beyond the reach of every person who had doubted her, Mia Morales understood one profound truth: miracles do not come from the places we expect them. They come from blizzards. They come from blood given freely. They come from a man learning to be gentle. They come from choosing to save a stranger. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs hope today. Subscribe, because tomorrow we have another story that will remind you why kindness is the most powerful force in the world. Drop a comment telling us, would you run into a blizzard to save a stranger? We'll see you in the next one. After the rain, the sky clears. And sometimes miracles come from the most unexpected places.